parameters related to HADR, and then the importance of monitoring HADR. Okay, in the last there will be a question answer session, but if you have any question in between, you can ask. You can stop me and then you can ask. We will discuss. Okay, so I moved to this next slide. So this HADR stands for high availability and disaster recovery. So as the name suggests, it has two components. One is high availability and second is disaster recovery. Normally, high recovery involves a single site with all the components are placed into the single site. DB2 pure scale is a typical example of high availability, wherein we have two servers, both remains active. So if the one server has problem, if the one server fails for any reason, then we have another server to take up the production workload. So with this, it helps to avoid the single point of failure. In case of disaster recovery, is typically involves separate site, or you can have multiple disaster recovery sites. So we'll see. For example, you have a production data center in, let's say, in Bangalore, and you can have another data center. You call it as a disaster recovery or DR site for example, it's in Hyderabad. Then using HADR, we can utilize the both. We can have both HA as well as DR site using the same single HADR feature. HADR allows up to 3 standby databases in your setup. One is called primary, second is called principal standby, and the other two are the auxiliary standby. So accordingly, in this case, in case of HADR, you can have maximum 4 sites. Let me allow someone is joining. Okay. Yeah. So you can have, accordingly, you can have up to three standby databases. Now DB2 HADR comes with DB2, and it's included in all the editions of DB2, including DB2 Community Edition. So it doesn't require any special installation. Whenever you install DB2 product, HADR gets installed. Means the HADR itself comes with DB2 installation. Also, it requires very minimal licensing cost for your standby. In case of if you are using standby for production workload, for example, if you are running any select queries, then I think you will require full licensing for the standby if the standby is active. Now, how this HADR works, it replicates the data. It replicates the data changes from source database called the primary database to the target databases, which are called the standby databases. HADR typically uses the database logs to replicate data from primary to the standby database. So it is the log which gets ships to the standby from your primary database. Log ships in the sense, I mean to say the data in the log, not the log file itself. The data in the logs get shipped over the TCP/IP network from your primary to the standby databases. and it uses the TCP/IP communication between the primary and standby. So what you required is the minimum TCP/IP network which connects your primary and standby databases. Okay, I move to the next slide. Now, before you know designing or considering using HADR, we should be aware about the limitations. We should know the limitations or restrictions of using HADR. As I said, HADR works on the lock shipping mechanism. It ships the transactions from primary to the standby. So it only supports archival logging. Suppose your database is configured to the circular login, then you cannot use HADR. If you have a partition database environment, whether it is a single party, whether it is a logical partition or physical partition, then HADR is not supported. So you require a single partition database for HADR to be configured. Now, another limitation or restriction is you need to have the same operating system version on your primary and the standby databases. Also the same DB2 level, except for a short time when you are, apply the fixed pack or perform the version upgrades. One more limitations or restrictions on HADR is it only ships the transaction which are logged. So anything which is not logged are not get shipped. Okay, for example, suppose you have created a table and it has a LOB column, and that column you specified as a not logged parameter, column you specified as a not logged, then such table column data will not be shipped. Also, the database configuration parameter will not be shipped. Suppose you are changing any parameter on the primary, then that will not be automatically shipped to your standby database. You will have to explicitly run the same database configuration command on all your standby. Also, that whatever gets written into the recovery history file will not get shipped to your standby because it's a non-logged operation. Okay. Again, load by default is not logged. So in this case, the default load will not get shipped to the your standby database. But we will see how, because you can still use these operations, non-locked operations, and on the primary. There is no restrictions of using it on the primary. You can still use it, but only thing is it is not a replicate to your standby database. Another thing is HADR does not support infinite logging. That means you cannot set your log second parameter to the -1. It's not supported. One more point is you cannot take backup of your standby databases. Backup operations are not supported. Also, you cannot connect to your standby database. You will get an error unless it is you have enabled the read on standby database. If you have enabled read on standby feature on your standby database, then you can connect, otherwise not. Okay. Yeah, so any operations which requires a lock to be written are not permitted on your standby. That means you cannot run any, even if it is a read on standby enable, you cannot run, let's say, reorg or unstat commands. Unstat requires a modification in your catalogs, and reorg also generates a lot of log files. It's a write operation. So these are such operations are not allowed to run on your read-on clients. So these are the limitations of HADR. Okay, I move to the next slide. Okay,
Milan,
HADR,
Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you. Can you just go to the first slide? I just want to have small
yeah,
before that. Thank you. I'll ask a question during the Q&A. Okay, thank you.
yeah, sure. Okay, yeah. So for HADR recap recommendation, we normally suggest to use you block the whatever the non-logged operations on the primary should be locked, because it causes the table data to be unavailable on your standby. So it is recommended to block all such operations which are not locked. So any such, for example, such operations are like create table with not logged initially option, or alter table with not logged initially operation. When you set block non-logged operations to yes, then you will get error when you run this alter table not logged initially option. Or even will not be able to create or alter table which has LOB column which is not locked. You cannot perform load with the default with the non-recoverable option and the copy now option. Another recommendation is, in case of HADR, is to use log index rebuild database configuration to on, so that even whatever the logging which happens on the index gets shipped to the standby. It will help to, you know, avoid longer time, longer takeover time in case of failure happens. Okay, I move to the next slide. Yeah. Now setting up HADR, here I have included a example which involves two servers. One is primary. So I have two hosts with Linux operating system. One host is host name is Rohit Linux 1, and another host name is Rohit Linux 2, and which has IP as which is displayed on the screen, ending with 53 and 72 respectively. So what minimum I required are the two servers and then the connectivity between the two servers. That's it. If I have these two things, I have these two things, then I can set up HADR. I can have HADR. So here are the steps for setting up HADR. So what I have done on the both host, what you required is to install DB2. Install DB2 on both the machines, Linux 1, Rohit Linux 1 and Rohit Linux 2. Then create the instance on both the servers. Instance name is not required to be, the same name. You can have a different instance name. And the next thing is to determine the host name, IP address, and the port number that the HADR database uses. Because the communication between the HADR databases happens with the dedicated, separate ports for HADR databases. We typically use 50,000 port for database service for the external clients to connect to the database. And for HADR, we have to use the different ports. So here I have used 50,010 and 50,011 port on Rohit Linux 1 and Linux 2 respectively. So the next step is to, here I have created a new database named HADR DB. According, suppose you already have a production database, you won't require this step, but this is a simple example I tried to show here. So I created the database HADR DB, and as per the requirement, uh, we have to have a archival locking enabled. So I changed this parameter, updated this parameter log argmath1, right, and set it to the disk, specifying a valid disk path. Then you, once you set, when you first time set the archival mode, then it forces you to take the backup. So the next step is to take the database backup. Then modifying the two parameters, database configuration parameters as per the recommendation that we have seen. So the next is to update dbcfg for these two parameters, lock index build and block not locked s. So these are these are the steps on the primary. We are doing this on primary DB. Okay. Then we have to take an online database backup of the primary database. Once backup is over, what you have to do, you have to ship this backup image. You have to move this backup image to your standby database. So here I used a cp command to move the database file to the instance home path on the other host, Rohit Linux 2. And the next step is to restore this backup on your standby. So what you are going to do, you take a backup of your primary database and then restore it on your standby database. And the next thing is to set some HADR related configuration parameter on primary as well as on standby. So accordingly, these are the parameters. You can see the local host, name of the local host, then local service port used for the HADR, then what is my remote host, then remote service port for the HADR, then the remote instance, HADR timeout parameter, some basic HADR parameters. Then the HADR sync mode, we will see what is it in the coming slides. So I set is the HADR synchronous mode, I set is to sync. Then HADR peer window, so I set it to sufficient time so that the automatic failure can happen within this limit. Then you try to connect to your primary database, and that's it. Your steps on the primary database are over. Configuration. Now next you have to do similar configuration steps on your standby database. So you update the same parameter on your standby with the local host and local port, remote host and remote service port as applicable. Okay, and the next step is start HADR as standby. So this is the start HADR we are executing first on the standby, and then we activate the standby. Standby database should be always active. Okay, to receive the uh, transactions from the your primary server. On primary, similarly, we will activate the primary database and then start the HADR on our primary database. Then you can try connecting, you can go to your standby and try connecting to the your database on standby. So you will get an error. will get a message that you cannot connect to your standby because primary is the only database, okay, which is serving the applications, and whatever the changes which is happening on your primary database will be shipped using the HADR facility to your standby database. So in this case, we are not using standby database for any purpose. So this is the typical example of the HADR setup. So what this error indicates, it says the command is not supported. But if you somebody joining, yeah, but if you enable read on standby, then you are able to connect to your standby database. So we'll see what is that and how we can enable read on standby on your standby database. Yeah, enabling read. So to enable the reads on standby on utilizing your standby database for read only workload, so that you can connect to the standby database and you can perform the read only operations. For example, you can run any select command on your standby. So for that, you have to set these two parameter. One is the read on standby on, and second is the standby uh, isolation level to UR. Because if any workload or any connections which use other than your isolation, then you will get error. So we don't know, because we don't want it to change the application, because it uses the default, whatever the default isolation level it uses. So what you can do, you can set this standby also to UR. So all your read operations will be converted to UR. So at least you will not get an error on select. So then you can try, creating one table on your primary, inserting some values and check, because once read on standby is enabled, you can connect to your standby database, you can query any database table, you can perform select operation. So this is the simple test I did. I just connected primary database, created one table T1, I inserted one row and just tried to check. So this way it guarantees that HADR has been implemented correctly, and whatever the changes happening on the primary are getting shipped to your standby. Okay. So next thing is to automate the HADR. Automating the HADR failover using the TSAMP cluster manager software. See, even if you don't, configure any cluster manager software, you can still use HADR. Only thing is, you will have to identify when your primary is down, and then you have to execute takeover command manually on your standby. Okay, if you are okay with this, you can still use HADR. But if you wanted to, identify the failure on the primary in the real time, and then wanted to take a failover happens automatically, then uh, you have to configure uh, a cluster manager software. So here I have used TSAMP, a cluster manager software, to automate the workload. So automate the HADR failover. Yeah. Another point is we have a pacemaker, an alternative cluster manager software available for automation failover starting from 11.5.5. So you can also use pacemaker in place of TSAMP. But in this case, I have used TSAMP, a cluster manager software. So we'll see how to configure TSAMP and what are the steps involved. So it's a long information. So what I did, I just copied it to my the text file. I will increase the font. How can I increase the font?
Under view.
Under view, okay. One moment. Document. Oh, correct, correct. Thank you. Okay. So is it visible now? Is it okay?
Yep.
Okay. So now these are the steps which involves in configuring TSAMP. So what you have to do on your both primary and standby, you have to run this prep RP node, and you have to specify the host name, the short host name of both the servers. So this command you need to execute on both primary and standby. So once that is done, then first you have to log into your standby using your instance user. Okay, so I logged into this Rohit Linux 2 instance user DB2 INSTA. This is the user I created for this test. Then I use DB2 High. DB2 High is the command, a tool which is used, is a text-based tool which is used to configure TSAMP. So just run DB2 High, then you will be prompted. You will get a prompt. You will get a welcome screen, and then it will be prompted. Here it will ask you the series of questions, and you have to just answer. You have to just input uh, the answer on the question. So first is asked to create a domain. Okay, then you have to enter the name of the domain you wanted to have. So here I have entered HADR domain. Okay, so then it will ask you how many clusters. Okay, which participating in the cluster. I said 2 because I have 2 servers. Now then it will ask you to enter the host name. So accordingly I entered this host name, Rohit Linux 1, Rohit Linux 2. Now it will create a new domain containing 2 machines. Okay, so create the domain. Yes, create the domain 1. I entered 1 for S. So create a domain. It started creating the domain. The domain creation successful. Then it asked me to configure the quorum device, which will be used for the decision making, which will be used to identify whether uh, one server is down and other server is ready to take over. It makes a decision. So I used yes, configure the quorum device. I used network quorum device, so I entered 1 here. Then I used any available IP, pingable IP for the quorum device, network quorum device. So I used this IP. Then it will configure that quorum device for the domain. Then automatically the HID ICU on the identifies the number of interface cards you have on both your servers, Rohit Linux 1 and Rohit Linux 2. So accordingly it identifies that yeah, it has ETH0 network interface card. Then it asks me to create either public network or private network. So I entered 1 for the public network. Okay, and then it gives its own name. Then it identifies that ETS0 is also there on Rohit Linux 2. Okay, this is it itself identifies. Then again it asks me, then it says adding network interface, and then adding network interface on both the host. Then it asks me, it identifies there is one more Ethernet card, ETH1. So I said okay, now create a private network for this ETH1. But thing is, here in my case, ETH1 was only available on uh, first host, Rohit Linux 1. It was not there on Linux 2. So then next is ask me to whether which cluster manager you wanted to use, whether TSA, which is the default, or any third party vendor. So I entered here one to use TSAMP software. Then automatically, it means it internally identifies the name of the database which is there under this instance. It identifies HADR DBs. Then I used use this HADR to automate failover, HADR failover. Yeah, that's it. These steps are complete now on your standby server. So next, what I what you have to do, you have to go to your primary, which is Rohit Linux 1, and then run same command HAICU. You will get a welcome prompt, and then you have to select the cluster manager software to be used, and then yeah, it will identify the database. Okay, so you use one to set up HADR, automate HADR failover. Yeah, that's it. It will ask whether you wanted to configure virtual IP address. You have to configure mount point monitoring. I said no. That's it. So when these steps are done, then your setup is done. Then you can use this lsam command to check the resource availability. Now here we can see for database here. Here we can see Rohit Linux, the HADR database, HADR DB database on Rohit Linux 1 is acting as a primary. It's online, and HADR DB2, HADR DB on Rohit Linux 2 is offline. That means it acting as a standby database. So this indicates if something means we are running all our production workload on Rohit Linux 1. So if this gets unavailable, then TSAMP should automatically able to detect that your primary is down for any reason, and it should able to fail over all fail over to your standby Rohit Linux 2, and this should be very transparent. So there is no manual intervention required in case when it is automated with using the cluster management software. The next thing, on your primary, you can run this command to see the status of your primary and standby and all the configuration parameters that you have used. It will give you a lot of information. Okay, so once this is done, you can perform your test. You can do a manual takeover operation by executing the takeover command manually on your standby database. And one more test you can do is you can bring down your primary active database or primary active server. You can bring it down and see whether the cluster manager software is able to detect and then fail over to your standby database. So I have the setup available with me here. Currently I am on this Rohit Linux 1. This is acting as a primary server. We can see using HADR command db2 pd. minus HADR. So we can see the HADR DB on this is now a primary, and this is my secondary. This is my standby. So what I will do now, I switch on to this Rohit Linux 2. This is my standby. So I am on Rohit Linux 2. I'm logged in as to instance user on this box, and I run this command to know the status of database on this server, which is acting as a standby. So what I will do, I will run the takeover command. Let's see. So this is the command I'm going to execute. So let's see what happens. It should able to, switch the role, and in LSM we should be able to identify the acting primary. So this command is successful. Now we can see it should become, now it was standby, it should become primary. Now after takeover, yeah, now this is acting as a primary. This should change, should reflect in your LSM output. Yeah, yeah. Now the database on Rohit Linux 1 is offline because it is now acting as a standby database. And Rohit Linux 2, the database on Rohit Linux 2 is now acting as a primary database. So this is how you can switch the roles manually. So this is planned switching the roles. Now we will do another test. We will now, this is a standby now. Can check using this command. Now this is acting as a standby. So what I will do, I will just intentionally will bring down this server Rohit Linux 2, which is acting as a primary. This is a primary. I will try to bring down this. Go to the root and we'll do reboot. So explicitly I'm rebooting the server. So now you come to this because Rohit Linux 2 is now down. So now I can check the status. So this much time the cluster management software will take to detect the failover and performing the failover. Yeah, you will notice the change here. This has become primary but disconnected state. So now this become the primary. It was a standby. Previously it was a standby. Previously this was a standby. Rohit Linux was a standby. When we bring down this Rohit Linux 2, now this is acting as a primary. This becomes a primary. It will take some time to reflect the change. Okay, and this is in disconnected because your standby is still not available. Let's see what happens to your standby. It's old primary. Let me log in. Now this has come up and now it is acting as a standby. It was previously working as a primary. So when we bring down this server, it becomes a standby and your old standby now becomes a primary. So this is the simple test we have did. Okay, now coming back to our presentation. Okay. Okay, so next thing about the configuration of HADR. So as we know, the network is a key part when we set up HADR. If you it is important you have a higher bandwidth, which is more than the log generation. If you have very active transactions going on in the primary and the rate of transaction generation or the log generation is high, but your bandwidth is not, that much high, which can ship all this amount of data from primary to standby, then there will be a blockage. So it is important what synchronous HADR mode that you select. So sync, let's understand what sync is. The primary will commit only after relevant logs have been written to the disk on the primary database. Okay, so whenever you run any transactions, the data gets written to your log buffer and then it goes to your log files. So the log file, the changes on the log file is first go to the disk, which that means it will be permanent. But it may be possible that it is still the change happened at the buffer pool level. Your page get modified, which is now got dirty, but it is not get written to your table space container, which is on the disk. So the first uh, permanent thing is means goes to your log file, because we have a write ahead logging. So if anything happens, means your server becomes, or whatever, your database become crash, then whatever the committed transactions or not uncommitted transaction which first goes to the log files will get uh, will get read during the crash recovery, and accordingly those will be executed or rejected. So in sync mode, the HADR facility waits for the acknowledgement, and the operation becomes succeeded when the data goes to the disk on both primary and standby. In near sync, it waits only for the acknowledgements when the data is received in the memory of the standby, your standby buffer. It doesn't wait uh, whether it is actually written into the log file on the standby. So here for sync and near sync mode, the primary wait for the acknowledgement. So for async mode, primary will consider replication done as soon as the logs are delivered to the TCP/IP layer. Here it will only check whether it is successfully delivered. It doesn't wait for the acknowledgement. And in case of super sync mode, the primary log writing is independent of routing. Doesn't check on either primary or the standby. So the recommendation is consider network delays when you choose HADR synchronization mode. Network delays affect primary only in sync and near sync mode. So you can typically use sync and near sync mode when you have a high speed interconnect between your primary standard, which is typically in case of LAN, and in case of WAN, you means for your, for example, you can have a topology wherein your primary and standby are placed in the same data center, the same site, and your uh, auxiliary standby is placed maybe some other disaster recovery data center. In that case, you can use async or super sync mode. Now, then another typically configuring HADR database is we suggest to use these two more parameters, which helps you to tune the TCP/IP socket buffer and receive, TCP/IP socket send and receive buffer size. So by default, the HADR uses this TCP/IP socket buffer both on primary and standby. So we normally recommend whenever you set up the HADR, the first thing is to also use these two parameters. These are the registry level parameters. So you should uh, tune this parameter to specific value and don't go with the default values. It, if you go with the default value, it's possible that you are not using your complete bandwidth you have between primary and standby. So now the question comes, means what are the good values, how to do, how we can determine, because these are something internal to the network and we don't know, which is very specific to the operating system. So what we can do, we don't know anything. So in that case, we have a SIM HADR simulator tool, okay, which is a simple downloadable file. The tool comes in a binary file, which is a downloadable. You can go to our site, you can download these these files, and then you can run this command. So in this slide, I have included this sim HADR underscore Linux. So for every platform, there is a separate binary file. So for this Linux operating system, I have downloaded the tool for Linux, and then I use these commands. Okay, so these commands will suggest you the values of this send buffer and receive buffer. So accordingly, you have to set these registry level parameters on both your primary and standby databases. Another thing is log receive buffer size on standard. So consider tuning this registry variable DB2 HADR buff size. So by default, it is 2 times the current log buff size configuration parameter on the primary, but that may not be sufficient. So we recommend, to explicitly set this parameter HADR buff size registry variable. So now monitoring HADR, we typically use this DB2 PD minus DB DB name minus HADR. You get a long output. So, and there are many things which you can see, you can notice, you can monitor, but most important is checking is how good my standby database, the state of the table space on my standby database. Because suppose you run any, uh, suppose you created a new table space on your primary and you specify some disk path. While creating the table space, you specified some disk path, and that path is not present on your standby. Okay, so in what happen in this case, your table space will be created on the primary, but your table space won't be created on your standby. So you will go on using this table space on your primary, and you will create tables, you will push data, insert data, you will do all operations. But when the time come and when you try to failover, when it failovers to the standby, you will find this table space itself is not available. It is an offline state. Okay, so in that case, there will be a danger of losing all the data, because the failover happens when your primary site itself is not available, or your primary has a problem, database has a problem, and after the failover, if you find the table space itself not, so that will be a considerable loss. So in case of HADR, it is also important you to monitor the health of your standby, because the standby can be anytime be a primary. It's a tomorrow's primary to be primary database. So it is equally important you to monitor. So we have a parameter in the HADR minus HADR output, DB2 PD minus HADR output. You have a parameter. You will find one uh, parameter HADR underscore flags, and this will indicate. So in our case, it was, let's see, in our case, it was HADR flag. Yeah, so this was TCP protocol, but in case of tablespace level error, it will change to this standby tablespace error TCP protocol. Okay, so you have to identify the health of the table spaces on the standby. So what you can do, you can run this db2 pd dbname minus table space to identify the table space which is not online, which is not in the normal state. And then you have to take the corrective action. Maybe you will restore the table space, specific table space, or maybe you will be allowed to initialize the standby database from the fresh backup of the primary. So like reintegration of your standby. Okay. Okay, that's it. I don't know if I go very fast or very slow, but let me know if you have any questions.
Christian, I have a question. I've seen that there was a requirement that has been raised long time ago about having the possibility to do a backup on the standby. Is that something that will be delivered once or in the near future?
No, yeah, I don't know, but currently it's not supported, but I don't know if we will be able to, allow you to take backup of the standby. But what you can do, maybe your requirement is the valid, but so we have a link where you can request for the additional feature to be incorporated in our future
Yeah,
releases.
I have already
Yeah.
put that requirement long time ago when I was working for in another company, but and I'm
Okay.
not alone. But
Okay.
since doesn't need to change on that point.
Okay. 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 I'm sorry. Actually, even I don't know
Okay.
because yeah.
But why you want to take a backup in standby?
Because we can basically stop. We can take an offline backup on the standby. That will be good in some case.
So in that case, you can ask your team to take a snapshot backup. So if anything goes in HADR side, you can restore and you can do the recovery.
Yes, I know, but it's it's a little
So
bit
I'm
more
saying,
complicated to take a snapshot backup, but just a regular offline backup, because you have also to manage all the disk snapshot stuff.
So you want to tell that in case primary is engaged with lot of activity and you don't want to take a backup in primary, you want to take that same backup
Yes,
activity in the
exact.
standby. So you want that
Yeah.
feature in standby. Okay.
no, actually, Oracle's also give this facility to take a backup from HADR side. So
Yes,
that's
Oracle SQL Server as well.
yeah, that's SQL
Yeah,
also.
I understand your requirement because you don't want it to use any resources on the primary when you have standby.
Exact.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
And
And
also,
Milind
if
sir,
the backup is long,
Yeah,
then
correct.
you will have that can cause some issue on
Yes,
the
correct,
transaction on the primary as well.
correct.
Milind sir, I have another question. Whenever we do the reorg activity in primary side now, so in that case, we are feeling HADR is going, flag is getting changed, and in that time, the active standby database, the user is getting issue because they would be not able to access those kind of. So is there any feature or any license which can come out on this issue?
You mean to say you are running any reorg operation on your primary database and your primary gets affected?
The HADR will be get affected because flag will be changed. Windows one flag parameter is there that will be changed, and due to that one, the reporting server will user will be get issue. They would not access.
So what is your that parameter in a log index build? So that is set to on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, correct. I think you will go. Yeah. That in that case, your standby will be affected. I think it will go into that mode. What it calls replay only
Flag will
mode.
be changed. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Window
think
will
replay only
be
mode.
Y. Window will be Y. And
Okay,
second thing,
okay.
what is the use of HADR target list?
That is when you are configuring multiple standbys
Okay.
because you have to specify multiple uh, host name or multiple IP address. So in that you will have to use in that case when you are configuring multiple standby.
Okay. The last question I have. Suppose you miss to enable your index anything and LOB or anything in primary side, and you do the takeover in HADR side. So in that case, whether we have to have the reconfigure of that new primary and new standby, or is there any option to recover? Because that time you are saying no, and
No,
stop it.
it will not because see, you mean to say you have performed some non-locked operation
Yeah.
on your primary and then there is a crash on the primary. The primary is no longer available and you are now limited to making your standby as a working as a primary. But when you fail over, when you take over, you found that one of the table space is not in the online state. Okay. No, I think in this case you will lose the data. So what is the best method? Maybe try to bring your primary up. If the data is important, I mean, you cannot run uh, uh, with means without this table space data. Maybe bring your primary up and try to salvage the data.
No, so again we can do switch over now, because once you do that takeover, and then you comes to know you miss something. So in that case, whether it is possible to roll back and you can go to again in the actual mode, primary as a primary and standby as a standby. I
No, I
don't.
think here. So once you have your standby working as a new primary, you realize that some of the data is missing. Some of the table space are not online.
Yeah, correct. This is exactly this is my question.
Yeah, then in that case, you can immediately, you don't run any transaction on your standby.
And again, you have to do takeover.
Yes.
I say, okay, sir. And what is the difference between that one, TSAMP and that one pure scale? Is there any difference?
Yeah, TSAMP is a cluster managed Tivoli system. It's a cluster managing tool, which is I think which is used also in pure scale. So SAMP used in pure scale also, and this is used in TSAMP means automating HADR, which is used in both. It's a cluster management software. But pure scale setup is active. Pure scale is active. So it's typically you have a all the servers means all the components in the one data center. Okay, but in HADR, what you can have multiple standby, and also you can have another site. Means one of the server you can have on a distant location on your DR site, which may not be possible in case of HADR, because in case of pure scale, because pure scale requires a high uh, speed interconnect between your two hosts.
And
In case of
suppose we
HADR,
have,
yeah,
I got it, sir. Suppose we have already HADR setup, it's all enabled, and then we want to have the feature of pure scale. So whether we have to reconfigure or we can go ahead from that point of that.
yeah, possibly this way. You already have what you can say. Suppose you already have a pure skill, so can you set up HADR over pure skill? The answer is yes.
But no, my question is that reverse. HADR we have, suppose we have a normal HADR and we don't have the license. After that one, client have the license and they want to move in pure scale. So whether it is possible without doing any reconfiguration of the HADR or primary, we can have this feature.
Yeah, see, it will be the primary which will be running on your pure scale. Okay, so the first step will be building up the pure scale, but in your case you have HADR setup which is well set up. So what you can do, maybe till the time you build, because pure scale you have to build by taking the backup of your primary. Okay, and then you will be restoring over you first prepare the pure scale setup and then restore your primary database. uh, uh, Take a backup of the primary and then restore on your newly pure scale setup, and then maybe you can switch the roles. So this way you can do like this.
Okay, okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay, any other question, guys? Okay, then if no further questions, I will conclude this session. Thanks.
I have perhaps a question that I want to add is that with latest version of DB2, we can also have SSL communication between HADR members. That was not possible before.
Good question. Good question. Yeah, sorry, I don't have the answer as of now. I don't know. So
I know,
you want
it's enabled in 11 one dot something, or at least in 11.5. But I don't remember if it's supported by TSA or not.
Okay, I will try
But
to
it's
find out.
supported by pacemaker, as a new pacemaker
Okay.
clustering
It is
engine.
supported. I did a configuration with TCP/IP SSL with the DB2 High 11.5 and it worked. It is supported.
Yeah, but if you have a HADR, the communication between HADR in SSL mode, I don't know if it's supported.
Yes, it worked.
It's
worked.
it. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. I have not tried that.
Okay, you mean to say the configuration, the shipment for the HADR happening through SSL communication? Not. This is what you wanted to say, right?
Yes, the two ports that is used for HADR member communication.
Okay. Okay, that will be over secure network. Okay. Okay, we will try to find out. I'm sorry, we don't know.
Okay, so Milind sir, do one thing, you can share the recording and these documents, as well as if it is possible, you can share the HADR setup, that documents what you had typed in the note.
Sure.
That and logs, if
Sure.
it is possible, now you can share that logs where you did the changes.
Yeah. I will share this PPT and the text file which I have shown you.
Yeah, putty logs also you can take in clipboard and share now.
Yes. We will share this.
So you have the mail ID, or we have to reshare the mail ID? How you are going to say?
No, we will use the same participant list to which we send this
Yeah,
invite.
yeah,
We will use the same distribution list.
yeah. You can share it. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
So will we drop?
Hi,
Okay.
Milind. I have a question.
Yeah, Harish.
Okay, so in future, like in 11.5, there will be containerized deployment as well for DB2. So how will HADR work in those implementations?
I think HDR should work on that containerized deployment. So I don't know, but do you want to say HDR doesn't work on that deployments?
No, I have not tested it yet, but I want to know like the steps will be same or there will be some differences in containerized environment.
I think it will be same. It should be same. Let me quickly check the link. I think we have that link.
In Red Hat OpenShift cluster.
No, it's not there. Sorry, this is not the right link I'm checking, but yeah, I will find out and will let you know.
Okay.
Okay. If no further questions, I will close this session. Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Milind. Bye.